When Diablo launched in 1996, it didn't just create a hit, it defined a genre. Dark fantasy, real-time combat, loot obsession, and that iconic isometric view, it became the blueprint. And as you'd expect, the late 90s quickly filled with games trying to capture that same magic. Some were ambitious, some were weird, some were honestly kind of janky. But all of them helped shape what we now call the action RPG. Today, we're diving into some of those early Diablo-inspired titles, the forgotten pioneers and clones that came out before Diablo II changed everything in 2000. Let's start with Dispel, a lesser-known but fascinating Diablo-style RPG developed by the South Korean studio Abalone. Right away, it checks all the boxes: isometric perspective, real-time combat, and a fantasy setting that feels very much in the Diablo mold. The game takes place on the continent of Deman, split into 3 regions: Aish, Yam, and Shereg, giving players a surprisingly large world to explore for its time. But what made Dispel stand out was its morality system. Your choices could actually influence the outcome of the game, which wasn't very common in early action RPGs. It also leaned into open-world exploration more than many of its contemporaries, letting you roam freely as a low-level adventurer instead of locking you into tight dungeon progression. And interestingly, it even received a multiplayer expansion later on called Dispel Colosseum, adding arena-style combat. It may not have been revolutionary, but it showed how quickly developers were experimenting with the Diablo formula. Now here's a twist. What if Diablo, but sci-fi? Cybermercs takes the familiar click-to-kill gameplay and throws it into a dark, futuristic setting. You play as a cybernetic mercenary in the year 2114, fighting off alien threats across a series of underground missions. Instead of sprawling dungeons, the game offers 15 linear, maze-like levels with clear objectives: rescue scientists, eliminate infestations, survive. Between missions, you return to a hub where you can sell loot and upgrade your gear. Very Diablo-inspired, but with a more structured loop. There's even a stats system where intelligence determines whether you can use advanced weapons, which adds a nice layer of progression. And yes, you can pilot giant robots in certain missions, which is honestly something Diablo never let you do. Cybermercs is rough around the edges, but it's a great example of how quickly developers started experimenting with Diablo's core formula in completely different settings. This next one is a bit obscure. The Broken Land, developed by Ace Platinus family and published by Arc Media, flips the usual Diablo formula on its head. Instead of descending into hell, you're trying to save heaven itself. The premise revolves around restoring 5 shattered land fragments after a divine war between gods and evil forces. Gameplay-wise, it sticks pretty closely to Diablo's blueprint hack-and-slash combat, dungeon crawling, and basic progression systems. But it was limited: fewer character options, minimal gear upgrades, and overall a simpler experience. It also had a pretty strange release situation: no proper printed manual, and a digital version that didn't always match the actual gameplay. Still, it's a fascinating piece of ARPG history, showing just how experimental and sometimes messy this early era could be. If you're looking for something that feels really close to Diablo, Ancient Evil is probably one of the purest clones of the bunch. You explore a massive 24-level crypt built by the magician Alaric, fighting through over 30 types of monsters in real-time combat. Classic stuff. But it did have a few interesting ideas. Character progression is based on usage. Fight more with melee and your combat skills improve. Cast more spells and your magic gets stronger. It's a system that feels a bit ahead of its time. Technically, it was also notable for using fully 3D character models with 360-degree movement, even though the game still used an isometric perspective. That gave it a slightly more modern feel compared to some of its competitors. It even got a sequel in 2001, which tells you it did something right. Now this one is special. Revenant, developed by Cinematic Studios and published by Eidos Interactive, takes the Diablo formula and adds something unexpected: skill-based combat. You play as Lok Davaram, a resurrected warrior brought back to save the island of Aquilon from a mysterious cult. So far, pretty standard. But the combat system? Not so standard. Instead of just clicking enemies to death, Revenant introduces keyboard-based combos and finishing moves. You actually have to execute attacks, not just select them. In a weird way, this might be one of the earliest examples of what we jokingly call an isometric Souls-like. It's slower, more deliberate, and more demanding than typical ARPGs at the time. It didn't fully land for everyone, but it's incredibly interesting to look back on. Finally, we have Nox, probably the most polished and innovative game on this list. Developed by Westwood Studios, the team behind Command & Conquer, Nox feels like a deliberate attempt to evolve the Diablo formula rather than just copy it. First, there's the true sight system. You can only see what your character realistically should walls, corners, and obstacles block your vision. That means enemies can ambush you, and positioning actually matters. Then there's the physics system. You can interact with the environment in ways that were pretty advanced for the time move objects, trigger explosions, manipulate terrain, and most importantly, the classes. Instead of minor stat differences, Nox offers 3 completely different experiences depending on your choice. Warrior, Wizard, or Conjurer, each with their own mechanics, playstyles, and even story variations. The story itself is also a bit more playful. You play as Jack, an ordinary guy pulled into a fantasy world through his TV, now tasked with defeating a necromancer queen. Nox wasn't just a Diablo clone. It was one of the first games to truly challenge what an ARPG could be. These games might not be as famous as Diablo, but they're part of the foundation of the genre. They experimented, they borrowed, sometimes they failed, but without them, the evolution of action RPGs wouldn't look the same. And just a few months later, Diablo II would arrive and redefine everything.